Welcome to this episode. The U.S. economy in 2025 poses a major dilemma for analysts worldwide. For the past 6 months, mainstream Keynesian economists have been almost unanimous in warning of an impending recession caused by high interest rates, high inflation, and massive government deficits. However, the latest data has surprised them. Far from a recession, the U.S. economy has shown considerable resilience, with GDP growth forecasts continuously revised upwards and inflation expectations even declining. Is the U.S. economy truly that strong? Or is this just the final hurrah of another massive bubble fueled by debt and stimulus policies? The answer to this question leads us to a central debate in economics that has persisted for nearly a century. On one side are Keynesianism, which advocates for government intervention and demand stimulation, and on the other side are the Austrian school, which believes in free markets and warns against the dangers of credit expansion. Today, we'll play economic detective and delve into how Keynesian theory is being implemented in the United States, why it is becoming less effective, and where it leads us in the future. First, we need to understand what Keynesianism actually is. Its core idea is actually quite simple and quite alluring. It posits that when the economy falls into recession and private sector demand, such as consumption and investment, is insufficient, the government should step in like a powerful turbocharger, injecting fuel into the economic engine through borrowing and increased spending to fill the demand gap, thereby smoothing the economic cycle and reducing unemployment. This theory sounds impeccable, right? But there's a key word here that later practitioners have, intentionally or unintentionally, overlooked: temporary. Keynes himself envisioned that the government should run deficits during recessions and surpluses during booms to repay the debts previously incurred to rescue the economy. This is a responsible, mutually reinforcing cycle. However, the harsh reality is that the latter half of this theory has never been truly implemented. Politicians quickly discovered a secret. Voters deeply appreciate government stimulus but deeply dislike austerity through welfare cuts. Thus, since the 1970s, fiscal deficits have become a permanent feature of the U.S. economy. Whether in boom or bust, the government has been constantly borrowing new debt and spending future funds. When a temporary drastic measure becomes a long-term drug, its side effects begin to manifest. The most obvious manifestation is that the effectiveness of government stimulus spending has become increasingly less effective. We can look at a very telling statistic. Today, for every dollar of GDP generated in the United States, approximately $3.50 in new debt is incurred. In the 1960s, this ratio was close to 1-to-1. This means that the economy is becoming increasingly dependent on debt, and the cost-effectiveness of stimulus is rapidly declining. Underlying this lie two fundamental failures of Keynesianism in the modern financial system. The first failure is the breakdown of the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. The modern practice of Keynesianism increasingly relies on the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to inject liquidity through interest rate cuts and quantitative easing, QE. In theory, this money should flow into the real economy, stimulating business investment and consumer consumption. But the reality is that most of this printed money has not found its way into production. Instead, it's trapped in financial markets, becoming hot money chasing returns and continuously driving up the prices of assets like stocks and real estate. To illustrate, it's like the government trying to irrigate a parched field, but the pipes are misconnected, causing most of the water to flow into a reservoir, with only a trickle actually seeping into the fields. The reservoir is the financial market, and the farmland is the real economy. The result is an irrational boom in asset prices on the one hand, and chronically sluggish real economic growth on the other. Data shows that the vast majority of the benefits of this monetary stimulus have accrued to the richest 10% of the population, who hold approximately 88% of financial assets, while ordinary people have to bear the cost of the accompanying inflation. The second failure is the complete collapse of modern monetary theory, MMT. MMT can be seen as the most extreme and irresponsible version of Keynesianism. It argues that as long as a country can issue bonds in its own currency, deficits are irrelevant, and the government can print unlimited money to support any expenditure. The 2020 to 2022 COVID-19 pandemic became a global, large-scale social experiment in MMT theory. The U.S. government injected over $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus into the economy, while the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero and purchased $120 billion in bonds each month. According to Keynesian and MMT models, such unprecedented monetary stimulus should have triggered a long-lasting economic boom. But what was the result? What we got was a short-lived, false boom fueled by overdrawn future demand, and the worst inflation in 4 decades. Data shows that after excluding relatively fixed housing and healthcare costs, the inflation rate, which is more relevant to ordinary people's lives, soared to nearly 12% during the pandemic stimulus period. This experiment clearly demonstrated an old truth. There is no free lunch. Trying to solve economic problems with money printing will ultimately only lead to a sharp devaluation of the currency and a brutal exploitation of the purchasing power of ordinary people. Faced with the steady decline of Keynesianism in reality, it's necessary to re-examine its arch-rival, the Austrian school of economics, embodied by Friedrich Hayek. The core difference between these two schools of thought lies in their perspective on a fundamental question. Is a recession a disease that needs to be eradicated, or a labor ache of self-repair? Keynesians believe that recessions are illnesses that require strong intervention, like the government's antibiotics. Austrians, on the other hand, believe that the root cause of recessions is precisely the unhealthy inflation, caused by excessively low central bank interest rates and excessive credit expansion during boom times. This artificial prosperity misleads entrepreneurs and investors, leading them to pour large amounts of capital into unsuitable and erroneous sectors, what is known as malinvestment. For example, this involves investing in concept stocks with no real profitability or in purely speculative real estate projects. From this perspective, recessions are actually a necessary, though painful but healthy process of market clearing. Much like a fever, it purges the body of viruses. In this process, misguided and inappropriate investments will go bankrupt, and resources will be reallocated from inefficient sectors to more productive ones that truly meet consumer needs. Keynesian government intervention, in the view of the Austrian school, is tantamount to forcibly giving a fever-reducing injection to a patient while he or she is feverish and then forcing them to continue their drinking and revelry. While this may temporarily mask the symptoms, it prevents the body from self-repairing, allowing the virus to accumulate, ultimately leading to a more severe systemic collapse. Modern policymakers are doing precisely this. With every sign of an economic slowdown, they implement more aggressive stimulus measures to prevent this natural process of liquidation. The result is that zombie companies that should have been eliminated are kept alive by cheap debt, and structural imbalances in the economy continue to accumulate, making each economic expansion weaker than the previous one, and each recovery relying on ever greater doses of monetary opium. This may be the underlying reason for the increasingly sluggish economic growth and widening wealth gap in the United States over the past few decades. So, if Keynesianism is so flawed in economics, why has it remained so enduringly popular among policymakers worldwide? Is this due to economic ignorance or political shrewdness? We'll continue this discussion in the next episode.